A 17-year-old girl, Zoe, nervously clutches her first-class ticket, a proud gift from her father. She's flying alone for the first time. But the moment she steps onto the plane, the flight crew smirks. They whisper just loud enough for her to hear, mocking her seat, her clothes, her right to be there. They decide she's a mistake and try to physically move her to the back of the plane. But as the lead attendant prepares to call security, a shadow falls over the aisle. A man in a captain's uniform boards. The entire cabin goes silent. And the crew's blood runs cold. The hum of New York's JFK International Airport was a symphony of chaos and anticipation. For 17-year-old Zoe Washington, it was the soundtrack to the biggest day of her life. Tucked into her backpack was a letter of acceptance to a prestigious summer program at Oxford University. And tucked into her passport was a stiff, cream-colored boarding pass for Global Airways Flight 101, non-stop to London Heathrow. Seat 2A, first class. Her father Marcus had surprised her with it. "No daughter of mine is flying coach to go study at Oxford," he'd boomed, his voice full of a pride that made Zoe's heart swell. He was a pilot, a man who lived in the sky, and this ticket was more than just a seat. It was a symbol. It was his way of saying, "You belong in the front." Zoe, dressed in a comfortable but neat dark green jumpsuit and white sneakers, felt a flutter of imposter syndrome as she walked down the exclusive first-class boarding lane. She was used to turning right when she boarded a plane, not left. The gate agent, a tired-looking woman named Brenda, scanned her pass, looked at her, looked back at the screen, and nodded with a fractional delay that Zoe felt in her stomach. She stepped onto the jet bridge, the scent of filtered air and faint jet fuel filling her lungs. At the aircraft door, she was greeted by two flight attendants. The first was a man in his early 20s, Mark Peterson. He gave her a bright, rehearsed smile. The second, standing just behind him, was the lead attendant, a woman in her late 40s with razor-sharp blonde hair and a name tag that read, Stephanie Rainey. Stephanie's smile didn't touch her eyes. Her gaze flickered over Zoe's jumpsuit, her sneakers, and her neat box braids. "Welcome aboard," Mark said. "Welcome." Stephanie echoed, her voice flat. "May I see your boarding pass?" Zoe handed it to her. Stephanie looked at it for a long, uncomfortable moment. "Seat 2A." "Yes, ma'am?" Zoe said, her voice small. Stephanie's lip twitched. "To your left, then." Zoe murmured her thanks and turned left into the quiet, spacious cabin. The pod-like seats were massive, each with its own television screen and privacy partition. She found 2A, a window seat, and marveled at the space. She carefully stowed her carry-on in the overhead bin, her hands trembling slightly. She felt a dozen eyes on her, though the cabin was mostly empty. She settled in, pulling out her headphones and a book. She was trying to become invisible. A few minutes later, as the cabin began to fill, Stephanie Rainey appeared at her elbow. "Honey, I need to see that boarding pass again." Zoe blinked, startled. "Oh, okay." She fumbled for her passport, pulled out the pass, and handed it over. Stephanie stared at it, her fingers drumming on the polished shell of the seat beside Zoe's. "Zoe Washington," she read aloud slowly. She looked up and down the aisle, then back at Zoe. "This is a very expensive seat." Yes, I know," Zoe stammered. "It was a gift." "A gift?" Stephanie repeated the word, tasting like doubt. "Right. Well, just stay put. We're still boarding." She walked away, joining Mark near the galley. Zoe, her face burning, tried to focus on her book, but she could hear them. Their voices were low, but the acoustics of the front cabin were sharp. No way that's her ticket, Stephanie was muttering. Must be a mistake in the system. Probably meant to be 22A, not 2A. She seems sweet, Mark offered, his voice hesitant. She seems lost, Stephanie countered. I've seen this a dozen times. Someone's employee friend messed up the booking, or it's a stolen pass. I'm going to check the manifest with the gate. I guarantee you she's not supposed to be here. Zoe sank lower in her seat. Every passenger who walked past seemed to be staring, assessing her. A portly man in an expensive-looking blazer, Mr. Gerald Henderson, settled into 2C across the aisle. He glanced at Zoe, then at Stephanie and Mark, whispering, and then back at Zoe with a look of mild disdain. The welcome aboard champagne was offered. When Mark reached Zoe, he hesitated. "Orange juice, miss. Just water, please," Zoe said. Stephanie, walking by, sniffed. Probably for the best. Zoe's hands were clamped together in her lap, her knuckles white. She was 30,000 feet from Oxford, but she had never felt smaller. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to her father. "On the plane seat is amazing, but it's a little weird. The crew keeps staring at me." She hit send just as Stephanie Rainey returned, her face set in a look of false professional pity. "Miss Washington," she said, her voice loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "It seems we have a bit of a problem." Zoe's head snapped up. Every passenger who had boarded the businessman in 1A, Mr. Henderson in 2C, a quiet couple in the row behind, was now looking directly at her. "A problem?" Zoe asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Stephanie said, tapping a tablet she was holding. "It seems there's a discrepancy with our seating manifest. We have you listed here." She tapped the screen dramatically. "But we also have a platinum medallion member who is supposed to be in this seat." This was a blatant lie. The seat next to her 2B was empty, and the cabin was nearly full. But Zoe didn't know airline protocol. She only knew the cold, sinking feeling of public humiliation. "But my boarding pass," Zoe said, holding up the paper. "Passes can be misprinted. Errors happen," Stephanie said dismissively. Mark hovered behind her, looking deeply uncomfortable, but saying nothing. "Look, honey, it's not a big deal. We have a perfectly good seat for you in Economy Plus. It's row 24, plenty of legroom." "Economy?" Zoe's voice cracked. The sting of tears was sudden and hot. "But my dad, he bought this ticket." Across the aisle, Mr. Henderson let out an audible, impatient sigh. "Young lady, just listen to the attendant. Some of us would like to depart on time. If there's been a mistake, just move." "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," Stephanie said, flashing him a grateful smile before turning her icy gaze back to Zoe. "You're holding up the boarding process. Now if you'll just grab your bag—" "No," Zoe said, a spark of her father's stubbornness flaring. "I'm not moving. This is my seat. Seat 2A. You checked my pass twice." Stephanie's false smile vanished. "Miss, I am the lead flight attendant on this aircraft. My job is to manage this cabin. Your presence here is causing a seating conflict. Now you can either walk back to row 24, or I will have to call the gate agent and have you deplaned." The threat hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Deplaned. Kicked off. Zoe imagined the shame of being walked back up the jet bridge. She imagined calling her father and telling him she'd been thrown off the flight. I don't understand," Zoe said, her voice thick with tears she refused to let fall. "What did I do wrong?" "It's not what you did, honey," Stephanie said, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's just a mistake. These things happen." She reached over and unlatched the overhead bin, pulling Zoe's carry-on bag down. "Mark, be a dear, and help Miss Washington find her actual seat, will you, row 24? Mark Peterson stepped forward, his face pale. "Miss, if you'll just come with me." Zoe stood up, but not to leave. She grabbed the handle of her bag. "Don't touch my things. This is my seat. I'm not moving." "That's it." Stephanie snapped, her patience gone. "You are refusing a crew member's instruction. That is a federal offense." She pulled her radio from her belt. "Gate Agent Brenda, this is Lead Attendant Rainey. I have a non-compliant passenger in 2A. She is refusing to move from a seat that is not hers. I need you to call airport security." Zoe froze. Security. Her mind flashed to viral videos of people being dragged off planes. Her summer at Oxford, her father's pride, it was all evaporating. "Please," she whispered, desperation making her voice shake. "Please just call my father. His name is Marcus Washington. He works for this airline. He can explain." Stephanie actually laughed. It was a short, sharp, ugly sound. "Oh, honey, everyone's father works for the airline when they're in trouble. Nice try." She looked at Mr. Henderson. "The things people will say to stay in first class, right?" Mr. Henderson shook his head, looking at Zoe with pitying contempt. "Disgraceful." The cabin was thick with a terrible voyeuristic silence. Everyone was watching the show. Zoe stood alone in the aisle, a 17-year-old girl, her bag in her hand, branded a liar and a cheat in front of a plane load of strangers. "Brenda, are you sending security?" Stephanie demanded into her radio. "One moment, Stephanie." The radio crackled. The cockpit door just opened. Someone is... Just a second." Stephanie frowned, annoyed at the delay. "Security, now, or I'll have the captain call." "No," came a new voice. Not from the radio, a voice from the galley, a voice that was deep calm and radiated an authority that silenced the very air conditioning. "That will not be necessary." The two words cut through the cabin's tense atmosphere like a thunderclap. Stephanie Rainey, who had been turned toward the cockpit, spun around. Mark Peterson, who was still awkwardly holding the handle of Zoe's bag, froze solid. Standing at the entrance to the first-class cabin, having just stepped off the jet bridge, was a man who commanded the space instantly. He was tall and broad-shouldered, in his late 40s, with a commanding presence that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the air. He wore the immaculate black uniform of a Global Airways captain. 4 gold stripes were stitched perfectly onto his epaulettes. On his breast pocket was a name tag, M. Washington. Above it, pinned to his lapel, was not just the standard pilot wings, but a small, unassuming gold pin that only the most senior employees of the airline would recognize the executive leadership insignia. The cabin went absolutely terrifyingly silent. The low murmur of passengers stopped. The click-clack of bags being stowed ceased. Even Mr. Henderson, who had been loudly rustling his Wall Street Journal, froze with the paper halfway open. Stephanie's face, which had been twisted in a mask of professional annoyance, went slack. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving 2 pale, ghostly patches. "Captain," she stammered, her voice suddenly a high-pitched squeak. I didn't know you were... Are you dead-heading?" The man didn't look at her. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the cabin until they landed on seat 2A. They softened for a fraction of a second as they took in Zoe's tear-streaked face. Then they hardened as they moved to Stephanie, to Mark, and to the bag they were holding. He took 2 slow, deliberate steps into the cabin. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. The entire plane was now his stage. "Zoe," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner. "Are these people bothering you?" Zoe let out a choked sob, a mix of relief and residual terror. Dad. The word hit the cabin like a pressure wave. Dad. Stephanie Rainey's hand, the one holding the radio, began to shake visibly. Mark Peterson let go of Zoe's bag as if it were on fire. Mr. Henderson across the aisle looked like he had seen a ghost. Captain Marcus Washington looked at his daughter. What happened, Zoe? They said my seat was wrong, Zoe whispered, wiping her eyes. She said she was calling security. She said I was non-compliant. Marcus's gaze swiveled, moving with terrifying slowness from his daughter to the lead flight attendant. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The icy calm in his tone was more frightening than any shout. Ms. Rainey, he said, reading her name tag with deliberate precision. You called security on my daughter. Captain, there was a mistake. Stephanie stammered, her professional veneer shattering into 1,000 pieces. The manifest, it showed a conflict. I didn't know she didn't say she was my daughter, Marcus interrupted, taking another step closer. Is that what you mean? Does a passenger's right to their purchased seat depend on who their father is? No, of course not. It was just a mix-up. A mix-up. Marcus repeated the words, hanging in the air. You, as the lead flight attendant, saw a 17-year-old black girl in seat 2A, and your first assumption was mix-up. Your first assumption was liar. Your first assumption was threat. You didn't try to help her. You didn't verify your information discreetly. You chose to humiliate her in front of the entire cabin. You threatened her with security. He turned his head slightly. Mr. Peterson. Mark, who had been trying to merge with the bulkhead, visibly jumped. Yes, Captain. Did you at any point try to de-escalate this mix-up? Marcus asked. Or did you follow Ms. Rainey's lead? Mark's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. His silence was its own confession. Marcus nodded slowly, a look of profound disappointment and cold anger settling on his features. He looked around the cabin, his eyes landing on Mr. Henderson, who immediately buried his face in his newspaper, his ears glowing bright red. Let's clear up this mix-up, shall we? Marcus said. He unclipped his own phone from his belt. Zoe, honey, take your seat. Put your bag away. You are not moving. Zoe nodded, sniffing, and slid back into the plush leather of 2A, the safest place she had ever been. Marcus looked at Stephanie. You are not to speak to my daughter again. You are not to speak to any passenger. You and Mr. Peterson will go to the forward galley, and you will wait for me. Am I understood? Captain, who are you? Stephanie whispered, a new dawning horror on her face. She was looking at the small, unassuming pin on his lapel. She was realizing this man was not just any captain. Marcus Washington looked at her, his eyes like chips of ice. He said, his voice resonating with absolute power. Am Marcus Washington. I am the Senior Vice President of in-flight operations for this airline. And you, Ms. Rainey, are having the worst day of your career. The silence that followed Marcus Washington's announcement was absolute. It was so complete that the distant whine of the auxiliary power unit on the tarmac seemed deafening. Stephanie Rainey's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The color had not returned. She looked quite simply like she was about to be sick. Mark Peterson beside her was visibly trembling, his eyes wide and locked on the floor. Galley, now, Marcus commanded, his voice dropping to a low growl. The two attendants scurried away like mice. The curtain separating the galley from the cabin was drawn, but it offered no privacy. The entire first-class cabin was a jury box. Marcus Washington turned, his demeanor shifting instantly from executive to father. He knelt by his daughter's seat. "Are you okay, baby?" he asked, his voice now gentle. All the ice melted away. Zoe nodded, the adrenaline fading, leaving her exhausted. "I am now. Dad, I was so scared. They really thought I was, like I'd stolen it." "I know," he said, his hand resting on her arm. "And I am so sorry. This never should have happened. You have every right to be in this seat more than anyone." He took a deep breath, recentering himself. "I was just coming to say goodbye. I was scheduled to be the observation captain on this flight anyway, doing a crew review. I was just running late from a meeting." The irony was crushing. Stephanie and Mark weren't just mistreating a passenger. They were doing it in front of the very executive who was there to grade them. "Dad, what's happening?" Zoe asked, looking at the curtain. "What's happening?" Marcus said, standing up, his executive face returning, "is a full-scale investigation." He turned to the rest of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Captain Marcus Washington, an executive with Global Airways. I must apologize for the delay. We are resolving a crew issue. We will be underway as soon as possible. Thank you for your patience." He strode to the front and pulled back the galley curtain. Stephanie and Mark were standing against the service carts, rigid with fear. Marcus pulled out his phone. He didn't dial. He used his secure company app. "This is Washington," he spoke into the phone. "I'm on GA 101 at gate C58. I'm invoking executive authority. I need a replacement lead attendant and a replacement junior FA immediately." He listened. "The reason is a Code 7 violation. Harassment and discrimination against a passenger. Yes, I'm sure. Yes, that kind of discrimination." Stephanie let out a tiny, strangled sound. "Get them from the reserve lounge. I don't care who you have to pull," Marcus continued. "And get Richard Poole from HR on a call for me in the next 5 minutes. Inform him that I am grounding Ms. Stephanie Rainey and Mr. Mark Peterson pending a full investigation. Their flight credentials are to be suspended as of right now." He hung up. He didn't look at them. He began pulling out service drawers, checking logs, his movements crisp and professional. "Ms. Rainey," he said, not looking up. "Give me your tablet." "Captain, please," Stephanie begged, her voice cracking. "It was a misunderstanding. The manifest. I can show you. Give me the tablet." She handed it over, her hand shaking so badly she almost dropped it. Marcus tapped the screen, his eyes scanning. "You told my daughter there was a Platinum Medallion member booked for her seat. Yes." I thought..." "There isn't," Marcus said, his voice flat. "The manifest is perfectly clear. Seat 2A, Zoe Washington. Confirmed. Ticketed. Paid. You didn't think there was a conflict. You invented one." "No, I would never." "You would," Marcus said, finally looking at her. "And you did. You looked at a 17-year-old black child and you decided she didn't belong. You bypassed every single step of courtesy, discretion, and service. You went straight to humiliation and threats." He turned to Mark. "And you had a choice. You could have been the sweet one you pretended to be. You could have pulled your lead aside. You could have discreetly verified the pass yourself. You could have done anything. You chose to be complicit. You chose to be a coward." "She's the lead," Mark burst out, his voice cracking. I just do what she says. It's my job." "It's your job to ensure passenger safety and comfort," Marcus roared, his voice finally breaking its calm. The entire plane flinched. "And you failed, both of you." Just then, the jet bridge door opened. 2 new flight attendants, a senior woman and a young man, rushed in, looking confused and stressed. Behind them was the gate agent, Brenda, her face ashen. "Captain Washington," the new lead attendant said. I'm I'm Maria. We were told to report here. Thank you, Maria. Marcus said, his voice returning to a business-like calm. You're the new lead. This is your new junior. Get this cabin secured for departure. I'll be in the cockpit. He then looked at Stephanie and Mark. You two. Off the plane. Now. Your badges are suspended. You are not to fly. You are not to enter any Global Airways crew area. You will report to the corporate headquarters in Queens at 0900 tomorrow. Mr. Poole from Human Resources will meet you. Take your bags. Go. Stephanie Rainey was openly weeping now, mascara running down her face. My career, my 20 years. Please, you should have thought of your 20 years. Marcus said, his voice void of any pity, before you decided to bully a child. He pointed to the jet bridge. Get off my aircraft. Stephanie, her face a grotesque mask of tears and ruined makeup, grabbed her rollerboard from the crew closet. Mark, looking completely numb, followed suit. They didn't look at anyone. They stumbled out of the plane, walking past a line of confused economy passengers, still waiting to board. The walk of shame was silent, brutal, and utterly public. As the jet bridge door hissed shut behind them, a wave of whispers erupted in the first-class cabin. Marcus Washington watched them go, his expression unreadable. He turned to the new lead attendant. Maria, please get started. Offer a pre-departure beverage to everyone. He put special emphasis on seat 2A. Yes, Captain, Maria said, her eyes wide, and she immediately sprang into action, her professionalism a stark contrast to Stephanie's malice. Marcus started to walk toward the cockpit, but he paused. He turned his head and looked directly at seat 2C. Mr. Gerald Henderson was once again completely hidden behind his Wall Street Journal. The paper was shaking just slightly. Marcus walked slowly, deliberately across the aisle and stood over the man's seat. Mr. Henderson, he said, his voice quiet. The newspaper rustled, and then very slowly lowered, revealing a face that was slick with sweat. Yes, Henderson stammered. I heard you earlier, Marcus said. You sighed. You told my daughter to just move. You agreed with Ms. Rainey that her behavior was disgraceful. You contributed to her humiliation. I didn't know the situation, Henderson protested weakly. I assumed the flight attendant was correct. One assumes. You assumed, Marcus cut in, exactly what she did. You saw a young black girl, and you assumed she was in the wrong. You, a passenger, felt it was your place to join in on the harassment. Harassment. Now see here, Henderson blustered, trying to regain some dignity. I do see Mr. Henderson, Marcus said, his voice lethally soft. I see a guest flying on a friends and family pass, specifically on the pass of a Mr. David Miller in our accounting department. Henderson's jaw dropped. How did you know that? It's my airline, Mr. Henderson. I know everything. Marcus leaned in, lowering his voice, so only Henderson could hear. When you fly on a pass, you are a representative of this company. You are expected to conduct yourself with a higher standard of behavior, not a lower one. You just failed that spectacularly. It was just a comment. It was complicity, Marcus corrected. Your son-in-law, Mr. Miller. I'm sure he'll be very interested to hear how you represented his family and his job on today's flight. I will be speaking with Mr. Poole in HR about Mr. Miller's pass privileges and whether they should be revoked permanently. The color drained from Henderson's face. The friends and family pass was a prized possession, saving him tens of thousands of dollars a year. You can't, he whispered. I can, Marcus replied. And I will. Enjoy your flight. He turned on his heel and walked away. Mr. Henderson sat immobile, his newspaper crumpled in his lap. He was for the first time completely silent. Marcus reached the cockpit door and paused one last time. He looked back at his daughter. Zoe was watching him, her eyes full of a new kind of awe. He gave her a small, reassuring wink, the dad peeking through the executive one last time. Then he pressed the code for the cockpit and disappeared inside. The flight to London was by all accounts perfect. The new crew led by Maria was attentive, kind, and exquisitely polite. Zoe was treated not just as a first-class passenger, but as a queen. Maria personally apologized to her 3 separate times, offering her anything she wanted, an extra dessert, a special amenities kit, a tour of the galley. Zoe mostly just slept the emotional exhaustion of the day finally catching up with her. When she landed at Heathrow, her phone was flooded with texts. The first was from her father, who had landed on a different flight an hour earlier. "Landed. Waiting for you past customs. I'm so proud of you. You were so brave. I love you." The second was an email forwarded from her father's account. It was from the CEO of Global Airways. "Dear Ms. Washington, I was personally briefed by your father on the events of GA101. On behalf of the entire airline, I offer you my deepest, most sincere apology." Zoe smiled. She closed the email, grabbed her bag, the same bag Stephanie had tried to wrench from her, and stepped off the plane ready for Oxford. The next morning at 0900 sharp, Stephanie Rainey and Mark Peterson were not in the sky. They were on the 14th floor of the Global Airways corporate headquarters, a sterile glass and steel tower in Queens that hummed with a quiet, expensive anxiety. The conference room was windowless. The air, chilled to an uncomfortable degree, smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner and burnt coffee. It was a room designed for terminations, a place where careers came to die. Stephanie and Mark sat on one side of a vast, polished mahogany table. Stephanie had clearly been up all night, her face a puffy mask of poorly applied foundation. She was attempting to project an image of wronged dignity, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mark beside her looked like a child about to be sentenced. He was pale, sweating through his shirt, and his eyes were fixed on a microscopic scratch in the table's veneer. Across from them sat the tribunal. At the center was Richard Poole, the Vice President of Human Resources. He was a man in his late 50s with a deceptively kind face, silver-rimmed glasses, and a voice that remained perpetually smooth, whether he was approving a holiday bonus or firing a 20-year veteran. To his right was Ms. Aris, a sharp, silent woman from the airline's in-house legal counsel. Her pen was poised over a yellow legal pad, and her gaze was analytical, assessing Stephanie and Mark not as people, but as potential liabilities. And at the head of the table, sitting in the chairman's seat, was Captain Marcus Washington. He was not in uniform. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored charcoal suit, a white shirt, and a simple black tie. He looked less like a pilot and more like a federal prosecutor. His face was a mask of cold, controlled anger. On the table in front of him was a stack of files. The top one was labeled Rainey S. "Thank you for coming in." Richard Poole began, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "We are here to conduct a formal inquiry into the incident reported on Flight GA101 yesterday. We have Captain Washington's preliminary report and statements from the replacement crew. We would now like to hear your version of events." This was Stephanie's cue. She had rehearsed this. She leaned forward, forcing a look of earnest remorse. "Richard, Captain Washington, Ms. Aris, first I want to offer my most profound, my deepest apologies. What happened yesterday was a terrible, terrible misunderstanding. It was not a reflection of my service. 20 years, gentlemen. 20 years I have given this airline. An unblemished record." She glanced at Marcus, trying to forge a connection. Captain, as a fellow crew member, you know the stress of a transatlantic boarding. The manifests they were flashing. The system was slow. I genuinely believed there was a seating conflict. When Miss Washington became agitated, I simply defaulted to my security training. It was a one-time regrettable lapse in judgment brought on by system error and a stressful environment. She sat back as if this explanation should and would suffice. There was a long, heavy silence. Ms. Eris, the lawyer, finally spoke, her voice dry as paper. A lapse in judgment. Rainey, your security training instructs you to publicly humiliate a 17-year-old, to accuse her of lying, to threaten her with law enforcement before verifying a seating assignment with the gate or the cockpit. Well, no, but... And you insist your record is unblemished. Marcus Washington spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room, silencing Stephanie instantly. He reached for the file in front of him and slid it open. I find that curious. Marcus continued, his eyes scanning a page. Because I'm looking at a complaint from 6 years ago. Denver International. You allegedly had a gate agent call security on a family, a doctor, and his wife, both in religious attire, claiming they were acting suspiciously. You refused to let them board. The flight was delayed 2 hours until a ground supervisor cleared them. The complaint filed by the gate agent himself says you referred to them over the internal comms as security risks. That complaint, I see, was later lost during a management shuffle. Stephanie's face went pale. That was different. It was unsubstantiated. Was it? Marcus flipped a page. 3 years ago. A flight to Los Angeles. You're in the galley and you joke, and I'm quoting here, that a junior attendant should go check the bags of those hip-hop guys in 3B and 3C for drugs. He paused, then slowly, deliberately turned his gaze to the man shrinking beside her. That junior attendant, was you, wasn't it, Mr. Peterson? Mark Peterson froze. He looked like a rabbit caught in a headlight. Stephanie shot him a look of pure, venomous warning. Mr. Peterson. Ms. Eris prodded her pen, tapping. Did you file that complaint? Mark's mouth opened and closed. Yes, he whispered. And yet, Marcus said that complaint was formally retracted 2 days later. An email from you, Mr. Peterson, stating you had misheard Ms. Rainey and that the issue was resolved. Tell me, Mark, why did you retract it? Mark was trembling. He looked from Marcus's iron gaze to Stephanie's murderous glare. He broke. She told me she'd ruin me. He stammered, the words tumbling out. She said she'd have me blacklisted from every good route. She said I'd be flying the Cleveland-Omaha red-eye for the rest of my career. She said she owned the senior schedulers, and that I'd be lucky to keep my job at all. I had just moved. I had rent to pay. So I retracted it. You liar! Stephanie shrieked, her mask of dignity shattering. You sniveling little coward! Enough! Marcus's voice wasn't a shout. It was a roar. The sound slammed against the walls. Stephanie recoiled as if struck. He stood up, planting his hands on the table. So let's review, he said, his voice a low, lethal growl. You, Ms. Rainey, have a documented pattern of racial profiling and abusing your authority. And you, he jabbed a finger at Mark, have a documented pattern of cowardice and complicity. You knew who she was. You knew her character. And when she decided to target a 17-year-old girl, you didn't just stand by. You assisted. He pointed to a large monitor on the wall. You cited manifest confusion. I pulled the logs. He clicked a mouse. The actual seating chart for GA 101 flared to life. There, Seat 2A, Zoe Washington. Confirmed. Ticketed. Paid. Ticketed, in fact, on my executive account. There was no platinum member. There was no conflict. There was no system error. There was only your prejudice. You lied, Stephanie. You stood in that cabin and you lied to my daughter's face to get what you wanted. Stephanie was speechless. She was completely and totally undone. Richard Poole sighed, adjusted his glasses, and folded his hands. The kind face was gone, replaced by the smooth, detached expression of an executioner. Ms. Rainey, he said, his voice returning to its procedural calm. In light of your documented history of discriminatory behavior, your willful fabrication of a seating conflict, your violation of federal guidelines regarding passenger treatment, and your blatant harassment of a minor, which I might add you performed in front of an observing executive Global Airways, is terminating your employment effective immediately. No, please. 20 years, she whimpered. Your 20 years are precisely the problem, Ms. Aris cut in. You were a liability we failed to manage. That failure ends today. Per the terms of your contract regarding termination for gross misconduct, all unvested pension contributions are forfeit. Your flight benefits and medical are terminated as of midnight tonight. We will be submitting our findings to the FAA. Poole then turned to Mark. Mr. Peterson, your failure to act your complicity in the harassment and your admission of enabling Ms. Rainey's behavior in the past, it demonstrates a fundamental lack of character and judgment required for our crew. Your employment is also terminated effective immediately. Please, Mark begged, tears openly streaming down his face. I just did what she said. I have nothing else. Given your cooperation in this meeting. Poole continued, ignoring the plea. The company will not contest your unemployment filing. We strongly advise you seek retraining in ethical conduct and perhaps find a career that does not require a spine. It was over. Poole pressed a small button on the console in front of him. You can't do this, Stephanie whispered. Her face pale with a new, dawning, impotent rage. I'll sue. I'll go to the union. Your union representative was invited to this meeting, Ms. Aris said, finally closing her pen. He was shown the file. He declined to attend. The conference room door opened. 2 uniformed, broad-shouldered security guards stepped inside. Ms. Rainey, Mr. Peterson, these gentlemen will escort you to retrieve your personal effects from your lockers, and then they will escort you from the building. Your ID badges, please. Numbly, Mark unclipped his badge and slid it across the table. Stephanie stared at hers, her 20-year lead attendant badge. She finally unclipped it and threw it. It skittered across the mahogany and stopped in front of Marcus. He didn't even look at it. The 2 ex-attendants stood. Stephanie, shaking with a rage that had no outlet, refused to look at anyone. Mark looked utterly broken. They were walked out of the room. The door clicked shut, and the silence that fell was absolute. Marcus Washington stood there for a long moment. He looked at the file. He looked at the badge. He felt no triumph. Only a grim, cold sense of necessity. The cancer had been cut out. Now the healing could begin. The fallout from Flight 101 was not a quiet, internal matter. It became a seismic event within Global Airways, a shockwave of accountability that radiated outwards, permanently altering the lives of everyone who had been in that first-class cabin. The karma, when it arrived, was not a gentle tap. It was a devastating head-on collision. Stephanie Rainey. For Stephanie Rainey, the fall was as swift as it was brutal. The 2 security guards who escorted her from the corporate headquarters were polite but firm. They did not let her go back to her locker. They walked her to the employee exit, where her ID badge was unceremoniously snipped in half. The click of the scissors was the sound of her 20-year career ending. She sat in her car in the parking lot for an hour in a state of numb denial. This was a mistake, a Marcus Washington overreaction. Richard Poole would call her tomorrow, apologize for the formality, and reinstate her maybe with a slap on the wrist. She drove home convinced of this. But the call never came. Instead, 2 days later, a FedEx envelope arrived. It contained her official termination papers, a Cobra health insurance packet, and a chillingly formal letter from the legal department. The letter informed her that due to the severity of the misconduct and a formal report filed by the airline, the FAA was opening an inquiry. That was the true death blow. Stephanie, still cloaked in the arrogance of her seniority, began applying to other major airlines. She had 20 years, she was lead qualified, she'd be hired in a week. The first rejection came from Delta. We have decided to pursue other candidates. The second from United. We do not have a position that matches your qualifications at this time. The third from a major international carrier was more blunt. A curt email from an HR representative read, "Ms. Rainey, we cannot move forward with an applicant who has a pending FAA misconduct inquiry on their certification." The word was out. She was blacklisted. The pension she had been counting on, the one that was vested after 25 years of service, was gone. She was 5 years short. Her 401k was hers, but the generous company contributions, the free lifetime flight benefits, the medical insurance, all of it evaporated. Months passed. The savings account dwindled. The denial curdled into a bitter, toxic rage. She blamed Zoe for being a sneaky kid. She blamed Marcus for being power-hungry. She blamed the airline for being woke and caving to cancel culture. In her mind, she was the victim. After 8 months of failed interviews, her unemployment benefits ran out. The bank was sending letters about the mortgage. She was forced to apply for jobs she once would have sneered at. She found herself in a group interview at a mid-level department store in the Queens Center Mall. The hiring manager was a 24-year-old with neon pink hair who kept calling her Anon. Stephanie, the former queen of the transatlantic sky, was hired for $15.50 an hour seasonal. The true soul-crushing karma arrived 2 weeks before Christmas. She was working a double shift, her feet aching inside cheap, sensible shoes, her uniform an ill-fitting red polyester vest. The store was a chaotic mess of frantic shoppers. As she was folding a pile of cashmere blend sweaters that a group of teenagers had tossed on the floor, she heard a sound. Laughter. Crisp, professional laughter. She looked up. A full Global Airways crew, a captain, a first officer, and 3 flight attendants, including a radiant young woman in the lead position, walked past the store's entrance. Their uniforms were immaculate. They strode with purpose, pulling their black roll-aboard bags, heading to the food court on their layover. They were confident, they were elite, they were her. Stephanie's breath hitched. She watched them pass, a perfect portrait of the life she had lost, the life she had thrown away. She felt a sudden dizzying wave of shame and rage. She dropped the sweater she was holding and fled, hiding in the dusty, windowless stockroom. She sank onto a metal stool surrounded by boxes of holiday decorations, and for the first time she wept. Not for Zoe, not for her actions, but for herself. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of the world she used to rule. Mark Peterson. Mark Peterson's fall was different. It was less a brutal execution and more a long, painful descent into humility. He took the severance, packed his small apartment, and drove 12 hours home to his parents' house in suburban Ohio. The shame of telling his parents he'd been fired for just standing there was acute. For a month, he wallowed playing video games and telling a self-pitying version of the story to his old high school friends. "It was crazy," he'd say over a beer. "This lady Stephanie, she just went nuts on this girl. And then bam, the girl's dad is like the CEO or something. What was I supposed to do? You could have done something, man." His friend Kyle said, shaking his head. "You just stood there and let a senior bully a kid. That's weak, Mark. That's just weak." The word weak hit Mark harder than terminated. He realized Kyle was right. His silence wasn't professional deference. It was cowardice. He wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He was a collaborator. The next week, he enrolled at the local community college, using his last paycheck to register for 2 night classes, Introduction to Social Ethics and Conflict Resolution. He got a job to pay for it, working the morning shift at a local coffee shop. His new lead was a 19-year-old shift manager named Becca, who ran the espresso machine with terrifying efficiency. On his 3rd day, Mark messed up a complicated mobile order. The customer, a man in a business suit, snapped at him. "Can you even read a venti half-calf no-foam latte? It's not rocket science." Mark's hands, which had been trained to pour champagne at 30,000 feet, were shaking. His first instinct was to puff up to call security to be Stephanie. But he had no power here. He looked at the angry man, and for the first time understood his own failure. "You're right, sir. I'm so sorry," he said, his voice quiet. "I'll remake that for you right now." It was the most humbling sentence he had ever spoken. As he steamed the milk, he thought of Zoe Washington. He realized with a jolt that this simple act of apology and correction was all he had needed to do. He excelled in his classes. He wrote his final ethics paper on the bystander effect in corporate hierarchies, using his own story as an anonymous case study. His professor gave him an A, noting, "Your analysis of complicity is both raw and incredibly insightful. You have a strong grasp of moral accountability." That comment meant more to Mark than his pilot wings ever had. Mr. Gerald Henderson. Mr. Henderson's flight to London was 7 hours of silent, cold panic. The moment the plane's wheels touched down at Heathrow, he turned on his phone. It exploded with notifications. 10 missed calls from his daughter, 7 from his son-in-law, David Miller, and 1 a single chilling text from David, "What did you do?" He called him from the taxi. David, an accountant at Global Airways, was almost incoherent with rage. You joined in. On my pass, Gerald," David shouted over the phone. "I was just hauled into a meeting with Richard Poole and the Marcus Washington, the SVP. They're reviewing all my employee privileges. My job, Gerald. All because you couldn't keep your mouth shut for 10 minutes. The friends and family pass was revoked. Permanently. The family trips, the free upgrades, the status. All gone. But it was worse than that. Henderson's daughter was furious. Dad David is in the doghouse at work. He's up for a promotion and now he's been flagged by an SVP. All because you had to play big man in first class. I hope you're proud of yourself." He wasn't. He was deeply, profoundly ashamed. The apology letter was the final humiliation. His first draft was full of excuses. It was a simple misunderstanding. "I was only trying to support the crew." David sent it back with a 1-line email. "Try again. And this time sound like you mean it." It took him 4 drafts to write a simple 2-sentence apology, acknowledging his unwarranted and inappropriate comment and his regret for contributing to Ms. Washington's distress. He flew home a week later, in economy. Seat 42E. A middle seat, non-reclining, wedged between a snoring man and the lavatory. Every time the toilet flushed, he flinched. It was the longest flight of his life. Captain Marcus Washington. Marcus Washington didn't just win a battle. He changed the entire war. He walked into a senior executive board meeting 2 weeks later and placed a single file on the table. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we have a cancer in our culture. We call it discretion, but it is prejudice. We call it seniority, but it is abuse. It just cost us 2 employees, nearly cost us a passenger, and has exposed this company to a federal investigation. I am not here to ask for a new training module. I am here to demand a new culture." He laid out his plan, the Zoe Washington Initiative. It would be a mandatory in-person 2-day training seminar for every single one of Global's 20,000 in-flight employees. It would use role-playing de-escalation tactics and real-world case studies, starting with Flight 101. One executive, a numbers-focused man from finance, pushed back. "Marcus, this is a multi-million-dollar proposal. The downtime, the trainers, all for one incident." Marcus's eyes were like ice. "This wasn't one incident. This was the one we caught. This was the one that happened to my daughter. How many Zoe Washingtons have we had that didn't have an SVP for a father? How many passengers have we quietly humiliated, lost, and turned into lifelong enemies of this brand? This isn't a training expense. This is an investment in our survival." He got his initiative. He personally oversaw its creation, vetoing the sterile corporate speak videos. "No," he said, reviewing a script. "I want it to be real. I want every new hire to feel that cabin. I want them to feel her fear, and I want them to feel Stephanie's arrogance. And then I want to teach them to choose a different path." Zoe Washington. Zoe arrived at Oxford. The ancient honey-colored stones of the colleges were a world away from the sterile, pressurized cabin of Flight 101. She dove into her studies, the trauma of the flight fading to a dull, distant ache. But it had changed her. 6 weeks into the program, she joined the university's famous debate society. The topic for the night was, "This House believes implicit bias is a structural, not a personal, failure." One speaker, a charismatic young man, argued that a few bad apples were the problem. Zoe felt a familiar fire light in her chest. She stood up. The room quieted. "The problem isn't just the bad apple," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It's the bystander who watches the apple rot and says nothing. It's the person who, given the choice between right and easy, chooses easy." She didn't tell her full story. She didn't have to. She spoke with a moral clarity and a quiet authority that stunned the room into silence. The other silence. The one of respect. She had found her voice. A year passed. Zoe, now 18, was flying back to London for her second summer. Her father again had booked her in 2A. As she boarded, she felt a familiar jolt of anxiety. Her hands were clammy. She clutched her boarding pass, her eyes darting to the crew at the door. A lead attendant, a kind-faced man in his 50s, smiled at her. "Welcome aboard, miss. Seat 2A. "Yes," Zoe said, her voice small. The attendant's smile widened. He leaned in, his voice low and warm. "Miss Washington, Zoe Washington." Zoe's heart leaped into her throat. "Yes? I thought I recognized your name," he said. "My name is Thomas. I want to say it is a genuine honor to have you on this flight." "Oh," Zoe said, stunned. "Thank you." "No, thank you." Thomas set his eyes crinkling. I was on the reserve list that day. I almost got called to work your flight. When we all heard what happened, we were so ashamed. And then we were so proud of your father and of you. What you two did, the initiative, it changed things here. For all of us. It gave us the good ones the tools to stand up to the Stephanies. He gestured to her seat. Please, enjoy your flight. You've more than earned it. Zoe walked into the cabin and slid into seat 2A. She looked out the window, a slow, confident smile spreading across her face. The plane was the same. The seat was the same. But she was not. She was no longer a guest. She was a legacy. She belonged. The silence in that cabin wasn't just about a powerful man boarding a plane. It was the sound of prejudice being called out. It was the sound of accountability arriving. Stephanie Rainey and Mr. So. Henderson didn't just make a mistake. They made a choice. They chose to believe the worst about a young black girl, and in one swift karmic moment, their own lives were turned upside down. This story is a powerful reminder that bias has real-world consequences, and that true authority isn't about the power to humiliate, but the power to protect. What did you think of Stephanie's karma? Was it too harsh, or was it exactly what she deserved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this story, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of drama, karma, and justice. We'll see you in the next one.